Hello, viewers. This is Dr. Kamar Chima. I'm here to host this conversation at the Sanober Institute about the protest in UK for Palestine, how West responding to the situation in relation to the liberal values and Muslim diaspora. And I'm very thrilled to have with me the chairman of the Sanober Institute, Mr. Azaz Ahmad Chaudhry. He's also the former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, and we are delighted to have Mary Hunter. She's a freelance writer on subjects related to Islamophobia, Pakistan, and diaspora in the Muslim diaspora in the UK. She has been doing research on Islamization of Pakistan, and she's also the PhD candidate at the University of St. Andrews. Mary, thank you very much for sparing the time for the Sanober Institute.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zasai. So just to start this conversation, since the war has started in Middle East where Hamas attacked Israel, and we have seen a disproportionate response has come from Israel, and we have seen there have been protests around the globe. So we really wanted, and we were very interested to have this conversation. So I will just open the floor and will ask Ambassador Azaz Ahmad Chaudhry to give the opening remarks about the topic, and then the Mary can talk on that.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Kamar. Thank you, Mary. It's an important topic, and I think the whole world is now talking about it. It is, in a way, a saddening experience for the whole world because so much blood is being shed. And one wonders how and when will this end. I would say I was about to use the word madness because it's not really fair for so many people to lose lives. We luckily now have this 4 days of humanitarian pause, and I hope that efforts will be continued during this time to extend this pause further into a hopefully permanent ceasefire. And if that happens, I think that would be important. But I think the biggest loss, in my view, of this whole episode is an intense amount of hatred that has spread around the world between the Semitic and the anti-Semitic dimensions. And this is so alarming in a way because the world was already divided enough. We did not really need this particular dimension also to come in. And it has come in. We have to deal with it. We have to live with it. I know that in the West, particularly US and Europe, there have been a series of protests at the popular level, at the people's level, but the governments are obliged to do what they think is in their geopolitical interests. Here in the East, mostly in the Muslim world, again, at the popular level, there is a lot of protests, but at the government level, not much has happened. Why did Hamas attack Israel? Why is Israel's response so disproportionate? Why should there be a collective punishment to the whole people for what Hamas did? All these are the questions we are all trying to grapple with. But at this time, I would say a lot of responsibility lies on the shoulders of Europe. Europe has been a bastion of development of human rights and other ideas. I think the people of Europe genuinely feel for humanitarian causes. So considerable effort lies on the part of Europeans. And I would say particularly British, because at the end of the day, it was the British idea in 1917 to create a homeland for Israel, and they also facilitated that in 1948. They also moved it to the United Nations. So United Kingdom has a role to play, and no wonder the people of United Kingdom are speaking up so much. So we look forward to hearing from Mary how things are, and then we take it from there. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Azaz Chaudhry. I would request Mary Hunter to please give your opening remarks about particularly on this idea, the protest in UK for Palestine. Thank you, G. Yes, Mary.
Thank you so much for having me on this platform. And I think what I'd like to begin by kind of talking about is contextualizing the discussion a little bit. When we talk about the kind of Muslim diaspora or Muslim community in the UK, we have to remember that this is around 3.9 million people who identified as Muslim in the previous census in 2021 in England and Wales, which is about 6.5% of the population. So it's a significant portion of the population, and Muslims had the youngest average age of kind of all religious groups at 27 years of age, which is 13 years younger than the kind of average age of the overall population. And unfortunately, 39% of those who identified as Muslims lived in the most deprived areas of England and Wales. So the kind of overall picture we have of the Muslim community is one that is both increasing and young, but it is also one where there is a kind of a correlation between deprived areas and also the percentage share of the Muslim population. And when we couple that with the kind of hate crime statistics targeted against Muslims and also Islamophobia in the prominent parties, we can understand that there is a great sense of disillusionment amongst the British Muslim community. And so when we link that to kind of the response of the British government to the current situation in the Middle East, we can understand why they feel alienated by the parties, why they feel alienated by the kind of response to the suffering of the Palestinian people. And so, as you've mentioned, you've kind of summarized the situation that is ongoing in the Middle East at the moment. Of course, we had the initial attack by Hamas, killing 1,400 people on the 7th of October and 240 people having been taken hostage as well. We have to remember that these people were targeted because they were Jewish, because they were Israeli. And it was also on the holiest day of the week, the Sabbath, for the Jewish community, and at the end of a Jewish festival as well. And then in response, kind of in the name of self-defense, Israel has killed over 14,000 Palestinians. And this is primarily through airstrikes and also its ground offensive. So this has been rightly termed collective punishment, as it has also cut off water and electricity to the Gaza Strip, which is a tactic it has used before. And it has also used indiscriminate violence against civilians, despite, many international calls that they should minimize civilian casualties. So the bottom line is that both the actions of Hamas and of the Israeli government amount to war crimes. And so, as the ambassador kind of mentioned, there has been a huge response to this in the West, and I'm going to specifically talk about the UK rather than the West collectively. And I think we can kind of characterize this response into three main issues, which is the response of the public, the response of the government, and the response of the media. And I'll just begin my opening remarks by just talking about the response of the public, and I'm sure we'll come on to the other topics later. But the response of the public is kind of twofold. We've got the protests and we've got the hate crimes. So in terms of the protests, we've had 4 organized by an organization called the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in October. And each one of these mainly voiced the demands of the Palestinian cause, the historic demands, which include an end to Israeli occupation, apartheid, and colonialism. But then we've also seen in the kind of last 2 a call for an immediate ceasefire and kind of a cessation of violence in that sense. And the number of people involved has kind of ranged from tens of thousands to perhaps up to 500,000 in the last one held in October. But probably the most significant one was held on the 11th of November. And of course, this is a very significant day in the UK because it is Remembrance Day, which is marking the end of the First World War and thus the end of violence and the beginning of peace, but also the sacrifices that our military personnel have made in all of the conflicts since then. And the protests involved between 300,000 and 800,000 people calling for a ceasefire was likely at the higher end of that number. And in response, there were kind of several hundred right-wing counter-protesters who were there to allegedly protect the monuments, which is referring to the memorials that the kind of remembrance service centers around. But ultimately, the police found that the right-wing protesters were the ones who engaged in a lot more violence than the pro-Palestine march, that they were looking for confrontation and engaged in some extreme violence. And in comparison, the pro-Palestine march didn't see that sort of violence, although it should be borne in mind that they did report that there were some intimidating breakaway groups and that some had committed serious offences. But at the end of the day, we kind of have to judge that based on how many people were involved in each one of those protests. And so we can't really say that those breakaway groups are representative of, the march as a whole. And then finally, in terms of the protests, there have also been some pro-Israel demonstrations. So on the 22nd of October, there was one in central London calling for the release of hostages. And of course, as the ambassador has mentioned, fortunately, there has been a deal reached to release 50 hostages from Gaza and 150 Palestinians from Israel. And then just to quickly briefly finish my opening remarks, is the issue of hate crimes as a response from the public in the UK. So this is an international issue whereby the Jewish religion and Jewish people have been conflated with the Israeli government, and also the conflation of Islam and Muslims with Hamas. And the consequence is that whenever either of those two groups commit an atrocity, the Israeli government or Hamas, then it is Jews and Muslims who kind of bear that brunt in the international community. So as of the 20th of October, there was a 1,353% increase in anti-Semitic offences in the UK, and also a 140% increase in Islamophobic incidents. So when we compare these to the wider hate crime statistics in England and Wales up to the year of March, up to the month of March 2023, Muslims were the most targeted group at 44% of all offences, and Jews were second at 19%. So Islamophobia might be a longer term, more consistent problem in the United Kingdom, but clearly since the situation in the Middle East has escalated, the offences against Jews has been far higher. And I think all of us who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause also have to stand up against anti-Semitism as well. So those are the kind of main issues I would say that relate to the kind of public's response to the situation in the Middle East at the moment.
Well, Kamar, I have a few observations that I would like Mary to address. Now, what is or was Hamas objectives, and what is or will be Israel's objective from whatever they are doing? Now, I'll share with you my understanding, and then you tell me, sitting in UK, as to how the intelligentsia in UK is looking at these things. My sense is that Hamas was getting worried that the Arab-Israeli normalization process will leave the state of Palestine out of the map, out of the equation completely. So in a way, they would delay or disrupt the Arab-Israeli normalization process. By this action, they also thought that they will bring international limelight on the Palestinian issue, which was receding into the background. So that, in my view, it appears to me, was the two main objectives of Hamas. As for Israel, it appears to me, at least under Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, that Israel is no more interested in the two-state solution. Perhaps they never were, but at least they went along because US, Europe, rest of the world were always keen on two-state solution. Uh, Israelis perhaps were not, especially the right-wingers. So they thought that Hamas attack of 7 October provides them an opportunity to completely wipe out the possibility of having a Palestinian state. There should be only a greater Israel within which, if some Palestinians want to live, they can live, otherwise, they should leave. Now, this is something that I have been able to glean, are my impressions. I would want you to tell me, sitting in Europe, in UK, what do you think were the objectives of both Hamas and Israel for what is happening now?
Thank you. I mean, I would probably say that the kind of association that people have in their minds here, perhaps that's kind of widespread about Hamas's intentions, is people have often, and this is kind of tying into the fact why some of the pro-Palestine marches have not been well received by, I think, the members of the government, for example, is because of claims amongst kind of people sympathetic to the Palestinian cause that Hamas wants to wipe Israel, off the map. And so there's often people talking about what the kind of manifesto of Hamas is and how much of it is kind of anti-Semitic and kind of concerned with the destruction of the Israeli state. So I think that's been kind of at the heart of some of the justification, for kind of cracking down on pro-Palestine sympathies in the UK. And of course, Hamas is a proscribed terrorist organization according to the United Kingdom. So I think these are kind of some of the perspective, I would say, amongst some of the people in the United Kingdom. And then I'd say that in terms of Israel, and I can only really say what is what I've heard. And I think a lot of people consider the kind of continued incursions of Israel as a response to the Hamas attacks as kind of an excuse to continue its occupation of Palestinian territories and kind of to extend that control, as much of the international community, already consider the Gaza Strip to be, under military occupation anyway. But of course, that's kind of increased since the 7th of October. So that's kind of how I would see it to some degree. I think I can only really give my own, perspective to some degree. And I personally see the current treatment of the Palestinian people as at least genocidal intent, if not a genocide underway. And I think that is kind of being forgotten, the Palestinian perspective and how Palestinians are being treated, I think is not being as much discussed amongst the British government as it should be at the moment.
So, Mary, we got the point of view. So I just wanted to ask you a question that how do you see the British government's perspective on this, since they have seen there have been massive protests, and in one of your writings, I think you have mentioned that there have been protests somewhere around 300,000 to 800,000, particularly in this Palestine Solidarity campaign. Do you think that the government thinks that there is a disconnect between what their policies and what the people are protesting, or do they believe that these protests are coming from the Muslims or from the liberal sections of the society? So we have to go with our policy rather than getting intimidated or getting influenced by these protests. So what is basically the mindset of the British government? Because I was just seeing that just today, David Cameron, the new foreign secretary, after meeting with the foreign ministers of the Muslim world, traveled to Tel Aviv, I think, and he was in somewhere inside the caves. What do you think about the government's response? Do these protests have some impact or influence, or do you believe that it's just a pressure tactic and they don't get intimidated by this?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a disconnect between what the public think and, as the ambassador was asking about, the intelligentsia, definitely the academic community as well, compared to the position of the government. And they kind of reiterated their position a few days ago on the 17th. And again, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, condemned Hamas for their attack and said that Israel had the right to self-defense and that civilian casualties should be minimalized. They've favored officially this humanitarian pause as opposed to a ceasefire, and have aligned itself with the kind of the stance of the US government. The Labour Party is also taking the same official stance. So if we look back, there was the vote at the United Nations General Assembly, I think at the end of October, and the UK abstained from voting for a humanitarian truce then. I think that was partly because the condemnation of Hamas apparently wasn't sufficient for their standards. But we should also bear in mind that the UK has sent, I think it's £30 million worth of humanitarian aid to the occupied territories as well. It's the Scottish Nationalist Party which has called for a ceasefire, in contrast to those two major parties, and they called for an amendment to the King's Speech, which included an explicit call for a ceasefire. And a vote was held to kind of decide whether this would be put in the Parliament, and 125 MPs voted for, but 293 voted against, which included mainly the Conservative MPs. Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, had said that if frontbench Labour MPs voted for the amendments, that he would sack them. And consequently, 56 Labour MPs rebelled against this. 8 of them resigned, and some others have been sacked consequently. But this kind of wasn't the first kind of conflict between the leader and the party itself, as there are some Labour councillors who apparently belong to councils where they had large Muslim communities. They've also resigned after the leader appeared to defend the cutting off of water and electricity as a right of kind of self-defense, which he kind of justified by saying he was responding to the previous question. But of course, that angered many people in the Muslim community. So a lot of the MPs have kind of been responding according to the views of their constituents, but also their personal belief that a ceasefire is the only way to kind of break the cycle of violence. And then in terms of the kind of response of the government to the protests themselves, the most divisive figure was Suella Braverman, who I'm sure you know has been sacked recently as the Home Secretary. And she repeatedly referred to the pro-Palestine marches as hate marches in both interviews and print. And she then wrote an article to the Times, kind of, it seemed to be sort of reminding the police that they had the power to petition the Home Secretary to ban protests if they disrupted public order. She was basically dichotomizing between the peaceful Jewish vigils on the one hand and the angry demonstrators on the other. She accused the organizers of the pro-Palestine marches having links to Hamas, and also suggested that they were trying to assert Islamist supremacy rather than, actually being concerned about Gaza. So she was basically trying to say that there were double standards between the police's approach to policing protests. But the Metropolitan Police responded in what I'd say is a positive way by allowing the march to go ahead, because there was no intelligence to suggest that it would seriously disrupt, public order. And the march was allowed to go ahead. And obviously, the police haven't said anything since to suggest that future marches would be prevented based on the conduct of the previous ones. And in fact, there's another big march due to take place in 2 days' time. So that's kind of been the overall government response, which when you have nearly 1 million people kind of protesting, calling for a ceasefire, one of the biggest protests in British history, and the government not calling for a ceasefire, as you say, there's a massive disconnect between the public and the government, and also academics tend to very much side with the calls for ceasefire as well.
So, Mary, a further question. So, and that is that since you raised this point of that how the former Home Secretary Sola Braverman, called these marches as hate marches. Do you believe that, or do you think that since we have been reading literature and we have been listening, particularly the leadership in the West, and we have been talking about the liberal values, and now we are in the times where the Home Secretary calls such kind of people as hate marches, and then there is no space where we find them that they can speak for the just cause. Do you believe that the intelligentsia or what the liberal values, they are left behind, and the political class, in particularly the Western world and particularly in Great Britain, they are on a different, they are acting on different course?
I think that the leaders kind of selectively, deploy liberal values when it suits them. And actually, Suella Braverman at the start of this article had actually invoked about freedom of expression, which is obviously guaranteed under our Human Rights Act. So she was kind of suggesting that there's a limit to that when certain freedom of expression leads to hate, and when it leads to public disruption, which was kind of the basis of her argument, I think, in that article with regards to liberal values. I think liberal values obviously means very different things in different contexts. And in the United Kingdom, we have what is referred to as the 5 fundamental British values. Although it's fair to say I don't think we have a monopoly on these values. But basically, the 5 are democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect, and tolerance of people who have different faiths and beliefs. And these were kind of formalized in 2014 under David Cameron as Prime Minister. And it was partly in response to the Trojan Horse affair, which I'm sure you're probably both familiar with, which is the alleged Islamist plot to Islamize schools in Birmingham, which there's been a lot of evidence to suggest that plot didn't actually exist. So some people have kind of referred to these values as perhaps upsetting also the kind of moderate Muslims. I think it was Nick Clegg who had written about that back in a few years ago. But ultimately, if we are to take these 5 values, these marches kind of can't be stopped, and they shouldn't be stopped, because as long as they're in accordance with the rule of law, and as long as there's tolerance shown for different people of different faiths and beliefs, and it seems to be the overwhelming case that the vast majority of marches have, kind of remained committed to that. And ultimately, individual liberty is freedom of expression. It is freedom of assembly. So I don't see how they can be stopped. But as I say, people will deploy these values as and when it suits them, I think.
You have rightly pointed out. So in the end, I would like to ask Mr. Azad Chaudhry that if he want to say some, you want to give some remarks.
Yeah. Apart from the fact that the disproportionate response from Israel was kind of genocidal, collective punishment, even apartheid, as the UN Secretary General said, that the actions by Hamas and Palestinians is not in a vacuum. I mean, there is a history, there is a background. When you push people to the wall, they would respond and react. But I want to zoom out for a moment and draw attention of both of you to another observation that I have formed, which is that recently the Arab and Muslim foreign ministers delegation reached up to China to play a role of some kind. That, in a way, whether China can play that role or not, but in a way, it reflected a loss of confidence by the Muslims and Arabs in the leadership of the United States and even United Kingdom and other Europeans for playing a role. They seem to be indicating by doing so that that the West is not behaving in an even keel manner, that they are so much behind Israel that they are ready to look the other way on the atrocities being committed by Israel. So, in geopolitical terms, it appears to me that U.S. Influence is waning very rapidly from the Middle East, and this vacuum might be filled by other powers, including China. Is this a valid observation? And my question is to both of you.
Well, I will just give a quick response, and I think the Chinese have to show the political will for that, and I think they are not very eager to show that political will right now. They're very much occupied with this idea that that the Americans and the partners are coming in Indo-Pacific in the backyard. So we need to look into that. So they are not using any kind of they're not showing any political will. At the same time, they got occupied with all that the alliance politics which the Americans have come up, and they're really busy when they believe that after this COVID crisis, this entire supply chain is shifting from China. Much of the industry is moving towards the US and India. So I think the Americans have come hard on the Chinese. So on one hand, the Chinese and the had the will to go for a mediation between the Saudis and the Iranians. That was a rapprochement, but moving on from this position, the Chinese neither have that will nor they have the capacity to engage the other Arab countries, or particularly Israel, for that matter. The only, I think, the country that has a will and that has the capacity, and which has shown, particularly, is from its gesture, the diplomacy that was shown by the American Foreign Secretary Antony Blinken. That was the only visible diplomat in this entire crisis, while everyone else was sitting at home just looking at how things unfold. So I think for that matter, Chinese need to show the political will, and they will have to come out of their comfort zone, which they don't want to come, because for them, what they believe is the economy matters more than any kind of a political ambition. So Mary can give her response, what the ambassador just said.
I'd like to say that I'm not an international relations expert, nor do I work on geopolitics so much. But I would like to comment on the kind of analysis that the Western kind of media response has been, heavily biased towards Israel, and that's certainly been the case historically speaking as well. I think there was a 2011 study that found that BBC One and ITV News heavily gave the Israeli perspective and not the Palestinian one. It also found that events are kind of decontextualized often as well. And I've seen this kind of in the most recent reporting on the escalation of that violence as well. So that kind of means that the actions of Israel can often be presented as kind of legitimate and always a response to Palestinian action, which of course is not always true. And as the ambassador says, it kind of decontextualizes the current situation from actually, over 100 years worth of history. And I think that, the media outlets have a responsibility to present that historic context as well, so that people can make their minds up as to who is in the right and who is in the wrong. But that doesn't seem to be, the case at the moment, unfortunately.
So thank you very much. I think we have had a good discussion. Different aspects have come from Mary's point of view and her remarks, which she has given on this particular topic, that the protests in UK for Palestine. This is something obviously a very new thing which we are seeing, particularly in this age of digital media. We have been seeing such kind of things, or this have happened back years ago or decades ago, when the mainstream media had a complete monopoly. But since everybody is on social media, and I was seeing a report of the TRT that that the justice for Palestinians hashtags for like this, they were getting more hits on TikTok as compared to the sympathetic remarks for the Israel. So much of the feedback which is coming from the global public, I think that is definitely impacting the policies, and it's a challenge for the governments, particularly in the West, that how they need to respond to this opinion which is coming from public, and they're speaking and they're asking and they're reminding the governments to look for the values which you have been preaching and asking others to practice. Thank you very much, Mary Hunter, and thank you very much, Ambassador Azaz Chaudhry, for sparing the time for the Sanober Institute.
Thank you. Thank you very much.